This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. This episode features a conversation that I had just yesterday with Reverend Angela Denker, who wrote the book Red State Christians, which was initially published in 2019, but was re-released and updated just this past year. In this conversation, we talk about the midterm elections, we talk about the things that have changed in the United States since her book was initially released in 2019. I did speak with her earlier closer to when the book first came out. You can find that in the feed, and I will link to that episode in the show notes. We talk about her role as someone who works in a local parish in a rural area of Minnesota, as well as all the various different lenses that she brings to understanding what is happening and transpiring and why the midterms didn't shake out in this sort of red wave or red tsunami that a lot of people are predicting. Predicting the future is a bit of a fool's errand, but we do try to consider what there is to learn from the fact that there was a pretty clear repudiation of a lot of extremism. That doesn't mean that this extremism will not be a threat, that people should not be weary or wary of these things, but rather, well, maybe there is some hope to hold on to or to find in the most recent midterm elections. So this was just recorded yesterday. It's only been lightly edited to sort of remove filler words and maybe improve some audio quality here and there. But please bear that in mind. It's a little bit different than most of the episodes that you find in this feed. But because of the newsworthiness of it, or rather at least the timeliness of it, I was hoping to just publish this as quickly as possible. We just spoke yesterday, and this is being released today into the feed. So please have a listen. Let me know what you think about it on Substack. Twitter seems to be imploding, so that may not be the best place to reach me or many other people moving forward, but I do publish a Substack publication that I've been keeping up for the last couple of years. You've heard me mention it here. It's called the Post-Evangelical Post, because all of my ideas begin as puns. So, as a result, you can go over to postevangelicalpost.com, which is where you can find links to all the evangelical episodes, as well as my writing, as well as my other podcast, Powers and Principalities. All of it is there at postevangelicalpost.com. You can subscribe for free. You can also upgrade to a paid subscription at $4, $6, or $8 a month. I utilize Substack's coupon feature to do something similar to Patreon. All of those tiers give you the same benefits, which are first and foremost ad-free podcast feeds, as well as some subscriber-only content that I publish on Substack from time to time, including short-form podcasts called Pep Talk and some other things. I have lost, just due to the sort of economic downturn that is affecting everyone, that does, of course, impact folks like myself as well. So if you are able and you appreciate this show, please go and subscribe over at postevangelicalpost.com. You can find all the links again at postevangelicalpost.com/support. That's where you can find all the different ways you can support the show, including buying things from my affiliate bookshop.org page, purchasing merch. All of that is there. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok and even YouTube now at brchastain_. If you want to learn more about Christian nationalism, there's a really wonderful event being put on by Straight White American Jesus, a fellow Irreverent Media Group podcast, that is happening on November 18th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. It is being held at the University of Denver, but it's also going to be recorded and broadcast virtually. It's going to be put on again by Straight White American Jesus from IMG. And if you want to register for that and get 25% off, head on over to bradonishi.com/nationalism to register and use the code SWAG, SWAG 25 for 25% off in-person and virtual tickets. This is going to be a great panel including Brad Onishi, Samuel Perry, Philip Gorski, Catherine Stewart, Larissa Hawkins, Jacqueline Hidalgo, Kyati Joshi, and Robert Jones. Some of those people you've actually heard on another podcast that I did in 2020 called Powers and Principalities. The first season of that show is all about white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. You can find that wherever you listen to your podcasts, and it includes a number of those folks that will be joining Brad next week at this event. So again, please head over to bradonishi.com/nationalism to register and use code SWAG, SWAG 25 for 25% off in-person and virtual tickets. All right, everyone, let's get into it. Hello and welcome to Exvangelical. My guest today is Reverend Angela Denker. She is the author of the book Red State Christians, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, which has been re-released with an update. Angela has been on the show before. Welcome back, Angela.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I'm happy to talk to you again. We're recording this a couple of days after the 2022 midterms, and very curious to talk to you about the sort of developments we've seen over the last couple of years and even over the last couple of days. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk about your book, and if you could just summarize what your book was initially about. It was initially published in 2019, and why you felt it necessary to update the book and what those updates entail.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it first came out August 2019. I did the bulk of the research. I spent 2018 traveling across the country researching Christian nationalism, researching Christian voters in red states and red counties. And, here we are. We're sitting here a couple days after J.D. Vance got elected to the U.S. Senate with big support from Trump. And it's interesting, the connection to my book is that Hillbilly Elegy had just come out when I was getting my book contract, and the publisher, so they actually pitched this idea to me to write this book. And they said, at the time, they said, "Oh, we're viewing this as the Christian version of Hillbilly Elegy," which is like super cringy now. And, just shows how much everything has changed in these past 4 or 5 years. And so a big shift too from, that initial focus. And again, the book does really, the first chapter centers on Christian nationalism, the second chapter is on abortion, the third chapter is on guns. So many of the same consistent themes that we continue to see in the movement of Trumpism and right-wing conservative evangelical Christianity, but a big shift. So I released the updated edition just this past August, and you can even see the shift in the subtitle. So initially, as you said, it was Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, which frankly I hated that subtitle because I think it lent itself to this idea that here I am, this expert who's going to come in and tell you how to understand people. And it's almost like this, parachute effect that you see in national media. We're going to go to a cafe in rural Iowa and talk to Trump voters. And I hate that kind of thing. And so instead of understanding, I had wanted meat, because I think especially at that point in 2019, there still was really no understanding. I mean, we're still, breaking down how to understand this movement. And I don't think my book was necessarily intended as understanding. It was more about meeting and also beginning to unpack some of these trends that we continue to see in politics and in American Christian life. But the new subtitle is A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind, and really picks up on how this movement of right-wing Christianity has been shaped and has influenced our experience as Americans of COVID, of George Floyd's murder, which happened just a few miles from my home, and the January 6th insurrection. So that's kind of the focus of the new content for the 2022 edition, as well as my own personal experience, both in my rural church and within my own family, of the ways that Trumpism continues to create a lot of wreckage in people's lives and Christian nationalism as well.
Absolutely. And in addition to everything you just said, then it seems like even within title change, it signifies what has changed since then, which is now we refer to it commonly as white Christian nationalism or just Christian nationalism. Was that something that, I mean, was that something that while you were working on this updated edition, more cognizant of? Was that, wow, this thing that you did have at your first chapter was specifically about it. But by the time it reached the market, by the time the 2020 elections came, the quickly followed by the insurrection, that's when Christian nationalism and the more specific white Christian nationalism started to really enter at least the media lexicon. So, how did you perceive that sort of shift as you were updating the book, as you were positioning it for essentially the book market is a market. So, like, but at the same time, like, all of those things, the way in which media talks about these phenomenons that are very personal, but also very significant. How did you experience that?
Yeah, I think, it's been mixed. I've been encouraged, especially the work of Kristen Dumais and Jesus and John Wayne and Andrew
Hmm.
Whitehead, Sam Perry, and Taking Back America for God. They were some of the first people that I spoke with, even about my book, way back in 2018. So to see their work, Kristen from that historical perspective, and Andrew and Sam from that sociological perspective, I think it's been really important to have that work on a national media stage in a sense. Where I've been disappointed is I think still national media, and I say this as someone who began my career in journalism, in newspapers, I have a degree in journalism. There's this sense that Christians are like zoo animals and religious people in general are like zoo animals. And there's this sense that it's weird and it's odd. And how are we going to study them? And there's really a lack of depth when it comes to the theological piece of Christian nationalism. And I think that's a piece that you've really covered in your work and a piece that's really important to me as a trained theologian. And I just think you can't understand Christian nationalism without understanding how American Christians have been taught to view God and what kind of God American Christians believe in. And so that for me has been the missing piece in coverage of Christian nationalism. And I think that's why, unfortunately, it seems like it's going to just become kind of another one of those wedge terms. And people are going to feel a certain way about it based on their partisan alignment. And it's not gonna open too many new doors for understanding. Maybe some. I mean, I've certainly seen that with Kristen's work and Andrew and Sam's work and some with my work, but that's been my disappointment. When I initially released the book, I had a naive hopefulness that, it could be read by conservatives. And it's just been really hard to break through that. Maybe we're seeing some of that sunlight breaking through with yesterday's election results, or Tuesday's election results. But
Yeah. Yeah. I echo that sentiment. As far as not knowing, I'm very unclear sometimes about whether it's valuable to extricate Christian nationalism as a term from other aspects of religious life. Is it valuable to say that this is a sociological type term and use it in that context, or is it better to say, this exists and is expressed within particular traditions? And I that's just a sort of discomfort that I haven't been able to resolve really. I know in a recent discussion between Diana Butler Bass and Julie Ingersoll, Julie Ingersoll wrote the book on Christian Reconstruction, which is very much the predecessor and one of the sources for much of what we call Christian nationalism.
right.
And Ingersoll, she said, "This is what we used to call evangelicals,"
Yes.
and I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I'm fidgeting in my chair a little bit, but I mean, I think that's fair, and that is part of so many people's lives, whether it's part of their current life or their upbringing. That's very hard to. It's not as easy to quantify. It's not as easy to talk about, but I think there's something there too.
Yeah. Yep.
And on that note, you also do have a role in a local congregation. In addition to the work that you've done in writing this book and researching it and all of that, you also serve in a local congregation. And I'm certain that has led to far more concrete examples of the ways in which these things play out in congregational life or in the lives of your individual, those that attend at your congregation or parish. Is there anything, and I don't intend to put you in on the spot where you'd want to share something that would make you uncomfortable, but even on a broad level, have these issues as they've continued to develop within American society, have they shown up in your own church life?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another thing I don't think that we talk about enough. We'll see how this shows up among pastors who are really vocally supporting Christian nationalism, but I don't think there's enough conversation about how average pastors are dealing with this, particularly like you never hear from women pastors. You rarely hear from mainline pastors in the media. And I have led this life that has been, challenging and also really rewarding over the last 3 years. I'm coming up on 3 years of service as a solo pastor called to a congregation in rural Minnesota. So I live in Southwest Minneapolis, but I drive an hour west to serve a church primarily made up of lots of farmers, some school teachers, factory workers in a really small town that has, a few churches and a bar, and that's about it at this point in a baseball field. And I think there's a perception, I get a lot of comments, particularly like from journalists or from people, national media people, like they don't understand how I can have written this book and then also be serving in this context. Because there's this general idea that if you are vocal about what's happening in American Christianity, that you cannot also continue to live and work among people who are, my town's full of Trump flags, Trump signs. There's the most recent signs now have said, fix 2020 first before going to the 2022 election.
Oh my, I haven't
Um,
seen that.
oh, you're missing out. I've had confirmation students who during COVID were really convinced that if they got the vaccine, they were going to have, a chip put into their bodies. I had, in this past election cycle, one of my church members who's an awesome guy, he just got elected as county attorney in a, very conservative area. And, it was a nonpartisan role, but coming from a conservative legal background. And this is somebody who I've baptized, his kids. So I think that's what gets missed a lot of times is that many of us, and I'm sure this is true for many of the people listening or watching this, we have these ongoing relationships that we're trying to navigate in the midst of a really pernicious lie that's being purported about the gospel, that the point of American Christianity is to amass power and money and influence. And there's a lot of people who have come to believe in that as the gospel and support politicians who have supported that in a Supreme Court that has supported that. And yet, like we still have these ongoing family relationships that many of us are trying to navigate while also speaking out in resistance to this, what I would call perversion of the gospel. So I've continued to pastor there and we've continued to exist together and try to learn from each other. And I've learned a lot about rural life and they've learned things about Minneapolis. I had one of my kids who was really surprised that like my kids get to go on a lake in school in Minneapolis because he was thinking of it as, downtown and buildings. So I think it's been really vital work. And it's that kind of work that's not often rewarded and work that's really tough and misunderstood, but it's been really critical to my work as a writer and as somebody who wants to talk about this.
Yeah, I think the way in which you describe that, I think it gets to the point about how even though the media, that our lives are very mediated, especially during the lockdown
Right.
and the most 2020 part of the pandemic, it is still ongoing.
Right.
There's still COVID-19 remains a public health crisis. But during that period when there were significantly more people sheltering in place and taking those precautions, all of our life was mediated. But at the same time, even though our media ecosystems are very polarized, the local life that we have is not necessarily as cleanly split apart or delineated as those sorts of things are.
Right.
And that leads to complex relationships that are certainly not easy to navigate at times, but is part of local life. So thank you for sharing what you did with regard to that. One of the other pieces that I'm curious about as someone who is serving in a local capacity is the way in which language itself can be this thing that might be hard to work through, which is really just that the words are very simple, but then the concepts that they represent can be pretty complex with regards to Christian nationalism. It's very, a factionary position, maybe what's wrong with being proud of either being a Christian or being proud of your nation or both. Is that something that you've run into that feels different or distinct from when you're engaging this sort of thing from your perspective as a writer versus your perspective as a pastor?
Yeah, I think a lot as a pastor about, maybe this is a crude way to talk about it, but you think about you have a certain relational sort of account with your congregation and you build that up in, pastoral care moments. You build that up in building trust and things like baptisms, funerals, weddings. And sometimes then you withdraw from that account when you share a hard truth or a prophetic word, which I did after the insurrection, speaking about the violence that was really attributed to people who were saying they were there because of their faith, the violent rhetoric that was a part of that, and how I felt. As somebody, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, as somebody who's had somewhat of a public platform on combating Christian nationalism, I've had my share of nasty threats, emails, comments, and having been the recipient of that and then seeing the ways that bubbled up in violence, not only in January 6th, but we just saw it recently with the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. I talked to my congregation about, like, you know me, you trust me. We've been through a lot together. And I was threatened by what happened here. It's not just threatening to, like, nameless, faceless liberals that you don't like. Like, this affected me. And this is a threatening, violent movement that has deep roots in Christianity. I always
Mhm.
want to make the case that this goes back, to the Crusades. It goes back to the Tower of Babel. It goes back to this desire of human power and influence and money. But yeah, so I've, had to draw sometimes from that, and that's been costly. I've had people leave the church, but it's also really been forged on honesty, on relationship, and on just integrity, I think. And I think that there are still a lot of people who value integrity, and you kind of have to dig past the surface anger, dig past the surface, like, reaction to terms that haven't been explained or understood. But yeah, it's also been hard, right? It's been really hard.
What are you all right to pivot a little bit towards what's been going on in the last couple days, or is there
Sure.
anything else that we could really touch on there? Because there's so much to talk about with regards to how well, how the last couple of years have come about prior to this election season. We had Marjorie Taylor Greene selling shirts that said "Proud Christian Nationalist."
Right.
Some of those people, who do it for the attention, for the clout, to dunk on liberals, to gin up support from people that support these beliefs. Some of this is a lot of people that pay attention to these things are concerned about the extreme level of this rhetoric and what it can lead to and what it can justify, especially post J6. This was this it happened once, so it could happen again. So what even before you reach what came about on election night, midterm election night, I should say. Not
Mhm.
November 8th, 2016, but November 8th, 2022. What did you see? What were some concerns that you had about, let's start with politicians, and then maybe we can also talk about other religious leaders or other public figures. But let's start with politicians who were openly embracing or signaling to these Christian nationalist type positions.
Yeah, I mean, I had like a pit in my stomach, approaching Tuesday and was very concerned and not on a partisan level, like, oh no, but really just on a level of the kind of rhetoric that was flying around out there was so unmoored from reality and was so based in things that were just so ridiculous in some cases, these conspiracy theories that have been floating around out there. And the total loss for me, both as a journalist and as a pastor, I'm really concerned about censorship of the truth. And that there's some sense in which we can agree as human beings that there are some things that are true and some things that aren't. And it was really interesting going into the midterms that what I said to a lot of other pastors and people that I was talking with is that there's been this flip in Christianity. And I've experienced it as a female pastor. When I first started out as a woman pastor in conservative contexts, I would get and still continue to get, a lot of feedback that suggests because I'm a woman, I am betraying the true gospel. Or, there used to be a lot of talk about how the churches that I pastored were not Bible based, quote unquote, which mostly means, we say it's okay for gay people to be gay. And we say it's okay for LGBTQ people to lead as pastors in the church. And we say it's okay for women to preach. And so there was this sense that like conservative Christians, they were the ones who had the truth. But what we saw, I think, in 2022 is that got flipped. And there was instead now it was conservatives who were really saying, well, there is no way to really know the truth. And I think that came out of Trump, that came out of this nihilistic campaign of you can't trust anybody. So why don't you go with me and I'm going to help us win? And so I think conservative Christians, in kind of a public way, said, you know what? Truth is no longer important to us, which in a good way, I think opens the door for Christians with a more progressive perspective to go back and say, this is what we believe is the gospel truth. This is what truth is important to us. And so that was one of the things that I saw shaping 2022. But it was also one of the things that was making me so worried because I was concerned that there was this broad swath of Americans who just had totally abandoned any sense of searching for truth in favor of just raw, hard power.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, I mean, that is certainly true as far as like this notion of what you said of abandoning truth or not being concerned with it. I do think of like the sort of Carrie Lake, I believe, was an example that was highlighted in. I wish I could remember the source. I can't remember it off the top of my head right now. I apologize. However, they one of the quotes of hers was that even though she can't provide any evidence whatsoever with regard to the results of the 2020 election not being in favor of Biden, it's just a feeling. And it's just a feeling. And it is certainly, very much leads to a type of cognitive dissonance for folks who may come from a conservative place that may have been taught apologetics or things like that. That's that, this evident Josh McDowell says evidence demands a verdict, right? So it's where's the evidence,
Right.
and that's not provided because it's all going on vibes, just
Right.
just fascist vibes. That's
We're
that's
in a
really what it
great
is.
place.
Yeah, yeah. Though that is interesting to think of it as an opportunity for progressive faith groups or individuals to to push back on that and say, well, we have a shared like we do have to live in some shared reality. And that includes believing in our elections. And so much of what the Trump administration made clear was how much runs on norms. And when they're flouted, well, we get to where we are now. So, yeah.
Well, I keep thinking about this sense that movements that are built on really mistrust of one another and movements that are built upon hatred for others, ultimately, they end up being movements that are cannibalistic. And so I just feel like maybe we're starting to get to a place where some of this, call it maybe neo-fascist movement in America, Christian nationalist movement in America, some of the people within that movement are starting to cannibalize one another when it all starts to break in and fall apart on the inside. And I think the danger for the US has been, is there still enough less left standing when a lot of this crumbles to dust? It's not good for the US to have a totally non-functional major political party. That's not in anybody's interest. And so I think these next few months and years ahead are really going to be interesting to watch what happens with the Republican Party. And also, for American Christianity, again, I just think that I keep thinking about, even when I first started doing my research on Christian nationalism, that one of the Southern Baptist pastors who I talked to said that they had so strongly taught love of America and patriotism and Christian nationalism in their churches that it had so powerfully drowned out the gospel that when people were confronted with, this is actually not the gospel. Jesus wasn't American. Jesus was a brown Middle Eastern Jewish man. That what happened is that people lost their faith. They didn't let go of their political beliefs. They lost their faith. And I think there's been some statistics that have showed that this is starting to happen in the US, where, we end up having a movement that calls itself Christian, but the bedrocks of that movement have just come so far away from Jesus or the Bible that it's really, the word Christian has become such a misnomer that means nothing. It's almost become meaningless other than it's a right wing political term. So I think that's, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to loop back to what you said as far as people losing their faith. Do you mean they lose that in order to maintain a conservative political or social view? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Or I think, there's, yeah, I know that term losing your faith. Like, what does
Well,
that really
yeah, the reason why I
mean?
wanted, well, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding you because so much of what are admittedly conversations even that I have and that
Yeah.
others in this sort of online space tend to have is that people when they lose their faith, it's not many times it's to become either moderate or
Right.
progressive or something like
Right.
that.
Right.
Especially when you come from a conservative place. Generally, if you come from a well, if you come from a conservative religion or were born or raised in it, and then you can maintain a conservative religion and conservative politics. There's not as much dissonance there. That's what I was hoping to talk about a little bit more and make sure I had that correct.
Yeah, I think that is starting to change and be challenged. This sense that it's actually going to be conservative politics that are going to really threaten people's ability to, be faithful. And what's going to be so much stronger, and I think maybe people, who have been brought up, and even my own, touches of, I had a mixed upbringing between more of a progressive mainline church and also experiences with more evangelical faith groups and youth groups and things like that. But I think that, there's been so much shaming too. There's been so much shaming of people who have rejected evangelicalism or who have rejected the social policies of evangelicalism and have been told, well, now you've lost God, you've lost heaven, and I just think that's been so inaccurate, you know, and that's been a shaming tool that's really been wrong. And I think what's actually more accurate is that the people who have gone headlong into this Christian nationalist sense, they're the ones who have really lost Jesus. When your only conception of Jesus is a white American warrior who is gonna, be stomping around in his cowboy boots and, swearing and abusing women and, you know, being, sharing hateful language. That's not much of a faith. I really think, and I've been calling upon some of my fellow, mainline pastors to begin pushing back on that and say, for so many years, you guys, conservative pastors, came to us and said we were abandoning the gospel, we were abandoning the Bible, we were the ones who were pushing this false Christianity. It's you. You're the ones who've abandoned the gospel. You're the ones who have abandoned the Bible. You're the ones who have twisted the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I just think there's some time to like quit playing defense and, go on the offensive a little bit. Maybe that's the old sports writer in me. But
Yeah, though that is, I mean, y you are correct in that conservative pastors, as far as when even in ecumenical spaces or
right,
in the more public sphere,
right.
are always swift to condemn or distance themselves from more mainline or progressive expressions of Christianity. They certainly just write them off, but then the it's been interesting when looking at the history of religion in America in the public sphere or in the way who has the loudest voice in media or other aspects of public life. So much space has been ceded by
Yes.
progressive voices since the 1960s. I mean, that it from a lot of people's entire lives, including mine, it's always been the dominant voice is the conservative voice. And it is encouraging to see that those spaces and those concerns are not necessarily just being conceded. Conceded, CED, not ED, not EITED,
Yeah.
in the public sphere and in that public conversation, because it is valuable to have that discussion. I have my own sort of beliefs that many like conservatives isolated themselves for a really long time, and then whenever they showed up, they were hostile. So there's lots of reasons that contributed to that, but especially in this current political climate, it can't be given.
Well, and I just think it's such a shame, from a journalism perspective, how much of that ground has been ceded by major media outlets. If we look at the New York Times religion columnists, that both of them, a lot of them come from either conservative Catholicism or they come from denominations that are non affirming of LGBTQ people, that are, very limited in how they embrace women's rights. And that's, the liberal New York Times. And so I think,
Mhm.
again, when we're talking about language, we're talking about news media, there's really reasons to push back on what do some of these labels really mean when we have a country when news media outlets are owned by, in a lot of cases, billionaires. And if you're somebody who has extreme wealth in this country, even if you have some liberal social ideas, you are beholden ultimately to the gospel of capitalism. So I just think that there's a lot to be suspicious of. There's a lot to push back on. And I'm just tired of the shaming that's been done from conservative Christianity. I'm tired of the shaming that's been done from the pro life movement. And I think what we saw in the midterms is Americans are tired of that too.
What do you think there is that we can glean from the success or failure of a lot of these very staunch, proud Christian nationalist type politicians that ran on these sort of platforms that were vocal about it? The What can we glean from the fact that there was no red wave, there was no red tsunami? I mean, things did not shift as considerably as they historically have in the first term for a first term president.
Yeah, I was emailing with a former newspaper editor of mine this morning about how wrong, a lot of the national media outlets were about what was going to happen here. And what he was saying, and I really agree with, is that for a lot of, mainstream national media organizations, again, they have been so defensive when it comes to the criticism that they heard from, oh, you're a liberal or you are, enemy of the people, things that were brought up during Trump's presidency. So they've been so defensive, and their most typical response to that kind of criticism is, maybe they're going to bring in some Republican columnists, maybe they're going to just bend over backwards to try to seem like they're, being nonpartisan, even though by nature, if you're a journalist and you think people should have a lot of information, it's kind of a progressive, stance to come at, which so what my editor was saying is that sort of cowardice of major national news media has led to, we've got horse race coverage of politics rather than really an in-depth discussion of the candidates and the issues. We've instead got, you know, I think sports writers should stick to the horse race coverage, and political writers should focus on, writing about the actual issues that are going
Mhm.
on because they're not very good at covering horse races. They usually end up wrong. But so then what we have is so we have this kind of created narrative that again was wrong. And then we wake up and think, okay, well, what did the American people actually say in this midterm election. And I'm reminded of last night, we had a church council meeting, and one of my, farmers, just a real, like, kind of solid, hardworking guy. He, Trump voter, he made some comment at the end of the meeting. He was just like, well, after those elections, he told me about this devotion he'd read. And he just kind of said, it basically said to me, we're done. And maybe I'm reading into this, but I think in some sense, what we saw in the midterm elections is that a lot of voters were done with the chaos. The chaos of Trumpism, the chaos of, here in Minnesota, we actually had a pretty solid Democratic sweep of statewide races. And when I was watching the Republican candidates, their final speech kind of for governor and lieutenant governor, just the type of stuff they were saying about what's happening in Minnesota, how negative it was, how pessimistic, even though, people are having a lot of real financial struggles due to inflation. I don't think people I think what we saw in the midterms is people were kind of done with the chaos, done with the controversy, done with the conspiracy, and want some type of return to a functional political system. Whether that's going to happen or not, we'll see. But I think, we also saw that with the ultimate embrace of Biden in the ways that Biden continues to be written off and then continues to see there is an appetite for the type of politics and type of leadership that Joe Biden has represented.
Right. Just a no malarkey.
Right.
Honestly, I think he should lean into no malarkey and just lean into the dad granddad joke that is and just
100%.
have a functioning government. Yeah, because having so much of so much was done under the Trump administration that just undercut how governance should work and went against everything to such a degree just out of either abject loyalty or whatever else that and I think that is certainly a sentiment that a lot of I think you're right that we do see this at play in the fact that this is a bit of maintaining the status quo at least for a little bit instead of it just always
Right.
flipping back and forth every 2 to 4 years or both and it just being chaos, the pandemic being what it was, and still feeling so many people still feeling as if they're still recovering from that experience
Yeah.
is, yeah, that I'm sure that all led into it. What about Dobbs? And that also appears to be a major motivator for women and those who can give birth and there have been many anecdotes, and I'm sure there will continue to be more um, more studies and reporting on how Dobbs became a motivator, even for those who have historically voted for conservatives. But I don't want to overlook Dobbs as a major motivator for this particular midterm.
Absolutely. Yes. And that is hugely important. And I think in some ways it's another indictment of the sense of privilege and isolation that many in the political class or the news media live in, that there were so many reports coming out saying, oh, the Democrats need to focus on the economy. They shouldn't talk about abortion. People are going to vote based on abortion. Well, hello. Like, I'm a person with a uterus. I've had two children. I'm of childbearing age. This is existential for women in this country to be able to have access to reproductive health care. And I think the extent to which that was minimized in the lead up to the coverage of these elections just reflects the extent to which so many Americans fail to view women as people and fail to, not only women, but, people who can have babies, people who are capable of having children, as just being so dehumanized in this country for so long. And certainly conservative Christians have really led the charge on that. But I think these elections do show that, people are not going to stand for this ongoing dehumanization of childbearing people. And there's a right to bodily autonomy, there's a right to freedom, and there's a dignity that should be granted to every single human life in this country. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has done a lot to open that conversation. And I think it's continuing to be needing addressed and acknowledged.
And nationally, there certainly wasn't it certainly felt like we nationally avoided some of that chaos and avoided the political party that has presented that chaos for much of the last several years in particular did not gain as much ground as was forecasted or expected by lots of people, maybe even most people. There was just this assumption that it was going to be pretty definitive, and it wasn't. But there were also still states that did maintain that more Republican control or what have you. And I know we've sort of the way we've talked has been we haven't always name checked the two parties at play here, but we know what they are. That being said, with the historic voter suppression in some parts of the country,
Yeah.
as well as a number of other factors, that this was not a red wave and it wasn't a blue wave. So how do you envision the next few years? Are you even thinking in those terms yet? As far as how things might develop, or whether just as individuals and as local leaders or people that pay attention to these things, should we just remain as vigilant as we can and carry forward those same attitudes, or do you think there's a little bit of room to feel a sense of encouragement or motivation to keep pressing on these things?
I mean, I think if there's any place where we can gain some encouragement or hope, we gotta take it. Because we're gonna get beat up,
Sure.
as
Yeah.
soon as we look around the bend. So I'm certainly like telling myself to take whatever opportunity I can for sources and stories of hope. I also, looking at alongside the story of Joe Biden and his kind of story of personal tragedy, I think this story of Fetterman in Pennsylvania is an important story to look at. This is a person who comes from a decidedly different background, a decidedly different way of presenting himself than many political candidates. I saw a tweet that said Fetterman is like if a union was a person. And I just love that because it's been a long time that we really in America have honored labor, whether it's teachers, whether it's culinary workers, whether it's coal miners, factory workers. It's been a really long time since we have set labor workers as people whom we should look to in America to emulate and to honor. It's instead been founder or the tech billionaire or the,
Mm.
wonder kid, the venture capitalist, the influencer, whatever. So I look at this story of Fetterman and even, the fact that he then had a stroke and his difficulty on the debate stage and his very woundedness. I think it's an important story,
Mhm.
that he was embraced, that he was put on this big stage and he didn't necessarily change. I'm not saying he's a perfect politician or a perfect man, but I think it's a story to really look to when the Democratic Party looks towards, you know, what kind of face do we want to put forth? Because I think saw in contrast to Fetterman, you saw both in the Virginia gubernatorial election and in the Florida gubernatorial election. I heard a pundit say the other day that, in Florida for governor, the Democrats basically nominated a corpse.
Oh, no.
And there's been this like conventional wisdom that we're going to put the old white guy who has been, a former kind of moderate, and has been on the insider of the party. We're going to put that person forward as the safe choice. And I think it's important to distinguish between where that kind of strategy failed and Joe Biden succeeded. Like, because Joe Biden's also the old white guy. What's different about him? And then also what's different about somebody like Fetterman. And so, again, I think there's kind of that need to thread the needle between not playing it safe, going on the offensive, being really clear about the kind of policies that Democrats see for all of America, but also, in critiquing the pro-life movement and talking about what would it really look like to have an ethic of life from a progressive point of view when it comes to capital punishment, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to children, when it comes to gun violence, when it comes to gun rights, all those things. Thread that needle between supporting labor, looking towards rural communities that Democrats have ignored for a long time, but also being really clear about policies and being proud of policies rather than backing away from them and just trying to chart this, well, we're not them course.
Yeah. Yeah. Be proud of your accomplishments and actually promote them. Yeah,
Ron Rick.
absolutely. Yeah, that comment about your comment about how certain communities, especially rural communities, feel a bit of distance from, especially the Democratic Party, at least within the last several, I would probably say, decades. There is a lot of, but there is a lot of identity that goes into living in a rural area or a suburban area or an urban area. But maybe the fact that if Democrats in particular could talk about the ways in which their policies that they implement favor and help people in rural areas, then
Mhm.
that could help make the voters' decision be a little more informed and not primarily based on other aspects of identity politics.
It's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, yeah, because a lot of federal policies do benefit farmers and
Mhm,
things like that,
mhm.
and when it comes down to it, a lot of times the party they vote for is not the one that is in favor of those things. So it is certainly an interesting manifestation, I think, in American politics and public life that there is one party that often appeals to that rural person.
Look
Me
at
as someone from a small town and and
that.
and as with relatives from an even smaller town,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. I think Democrats left a vacuum and Republicans really stepped into it and filled it with, racist language and filled it with anger and hatred and grievance. And, I think there's a reason to reengage. And I think there are people in those communities that need some encouragement, that need they're vital tools of folks who are still working in those communities, whether it's teachers or union reps or, they just need a little encouragement from national Democrats.
So you sit in this interesting position where you're present in an urban area and you're also present in a rural area. You have your pastoral role, you have a writer's role. What are looking just in consideration of all of these different things that you're exposed to and experience and participate in, what from your vantage point are some things that you think will continue to have the most importance and the most impact when folks are trying to use Whitehead and Perry's terminology, reject or resist Christian nationalist ideology or policy within their local church or within their local governments or in their home. These things seek to have dominion over our entire lives. And that's why there are so many people pushing up against it. But you are in a position where you have a lot of different perspectives into this. And I'm just curious what you think is are some of the most impactful ways that people can, if they are seeking to resist or reject or you know to use a little bit of conflict language, like fight against these things. Does your mind go to relationships or to media or to all of the above? What sort of springs to mind for you?
I think there's a great desire, especially when I talk to people who have been wanting to be organizers in more rural communities or more conservative communities. And, for myself too, to be honest, there's this desire for making the big change or the quick change. And I think, what I'm really hearing instead is this call to dig in and stay where you are. And I think that's why from a denominational perspective, I think mainline denominations need to be really attentive to supporting their rural pastors and their
Mm,
pastors who are in conservative contexts because they're doing really vital work. Just to have that alternative to the Christian nationalist congregation, to have that alternative of a place that says, we're going to do community meals, we're going to do local aid, we're going to provide drives for caring for people in need, we're going to have the Christmas Eve service, we're going to have the Easter service, we're going to have youth education classes, just that an alternative exists in some of these communities. I think it's the same when it goes for media. Media outlets abandon local news broadly, and so there's no alternative now to the steady stream of conspiracy theories and right-wing news. I think it's the
mhm,
same for, it's the same for public school teachers. because in some of these communities, a majority of kids are starting to attend schools that are now espousing Christian nationalism, teaching Christian nationalism. So I think if you're a person like me who's kind of been working in this spot for a while and a lot of times feeling like, ugh,
Yeah.
there's this call to stay. And that's why I say I really think mainline denominations need to provide support to their local rural pastors. I think public school districts, state governments need to really provide support to public school teachers, ongoing battle, both here in Minneapolis and in urban district, in our outstate districts here in Minnesota. Yeah. And so, local news. I just think reminding people that these alternatives exist, that you don't have to, if you're going to leave the evangelical megachurch, that there are alternatives. I think that is really important. And to be proud of that alternative, even if like your church is struggling to get by, and like my church, we're like, do we need to, start publishing the budget numbers in the bulletin? Like, are we going to make it? That's a reality. And that's caused a lot of shame and silence from people from less moneyed organizations, many of which are less conservative. But I think that there's a need to stay where you are, be proud of who you are and where you are, and just kind of keep digging in.
And to call back to what you said about your church council member, this notion of, we're done. Does that signal to you that this is a period where people may be more open to changing their mind? I mean, because that's not at the sort of root of this show is it's my curiosity about how and why people change their minds and then change their eventually in many ways leads to very significant changes in their lives. And do you see that as like as a signal that we may be entering a point where people are, we're still in a very polarized place. Elon Musk is doing no favors for Twitter in that regard, but are you seeing that sort of maybe possibly playing out, of people being open to all these alternatives?
Well, I'm like so hesitant to say it because I have tended to be overly optimistic in the past. I thought after 2016, people would be like, oh my gosh, what have we done? Turn around, abort. No, that didn't happen. I thought after 2020, we're starting to see, okay, yeah, no, that didn't happen. And then speaking about, people that I'm close to, in addition to just national trends of people embracing Christian nationalism, conspiracy theories, QAnon. So I say with great trepidation that I think it's going to be a one by one, it's going to be a trickle of people. And what I keep going back to is really the wisdom of the 12 steps and the wisdom of that idea of recovery and addiction recovery. It's been an important part of, my family's experience. So I often turn to that wisdom of, you can't kind of force somebody to decide it's time for me to make a change in my life. But what you can do, and I just said this to a group of rural pastors earlier this week, what we can do is be ready and be there when they're ready to make that change.
Right.
So I think the task for people like you and I, the task for congregations, the task for community organizations is to be there and be ready to receive people when they're going to change their minds. And that's really hard work, but it is really powerful. And in the midst of it, I'm just going to keep like praying the serenity prayer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's a wise position to take, not only because, predicting the future is a fool's errand, yeah, you never know which way even one person is going to change, let alone entire swaths of people. But nonetheless, being there for that period, when or if some opens up a little bit to looking at things differently, then that's encouraging. And it's good to be that resource wherever that places you. So
Yeah.
yeah. Any sort of final thoughts with regards to what we've seen over the last few days and where your attention is being drawn to now?
Yeah, I think I'm going to, be continuing to watch and see where everything does shake out with these midterm elections. And I think as far as, the work in the church and the ongoing work of combating Christian nationalism, I think this is, as much as I kind of sometimes wish it wasn't this way, I think this is going to be, my life's work, I guess, is,
Mm.
continuing to champion a gospel that resides in the cross and does not reside in this triumphalism, does not reside in money and in power. And sometimes that's not a whole lot of fun. So I got to keep looking for other places to find fun in my life.
True.
I do think that, this is really critical work. And it's also work that, we should be proud of, that you should be proud of, that people listening to this should be proud of, and to not buy into this sense of shame that maybe this kind of work isn't bringing the kind of financial success or esteem that, a lot of people who have championed Christian nationalism have gotten.
Hmm.
To see the Amazon book sale success of some of these Christian nationalist books is just
Oh dear.
very
Yeah.
sobering. But, there needs to be a sense of pride in this work, and I hope that people can start to feel that.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I mean, whether you're doing this sort of thing within the context of staying in a religious tradition, or if it leads you out of it, it's a valuable work. So, Angela, thank you very much for joining me to have this lovely and sort of meandering conversation that touched on a lot of different things and veered into everything that this show likes to do: religion, politics, all of it all at once. Where can people find your book? Where can they find anything else you want to mention? I know you've started a Substack, so anything else you want to plug here?
Yeah, I'm all in on Substack at the moment, but it's been a nice community and I write 3 times a week. So angeladenker.substack.com. It's called I'm Listening. And the book, Red State Christians, I always point people towards Bookshop. It's a better place for authors and for readers than Amazon. And yeah, Twitter seems to be imploding, which might be a good thing, but we'll see.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows? I mean, yeah.
I'm on there for now. I'm not
Yeah.
verified.
Me neither. Me neither. Not verified. So it's all good. Well, Angela, thank you very much for joining me, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks, Blake.
Hello, and welcome to Exvangelical. My guest today is Reverend Angela Denker. She is the author of the book Red State Christians: Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, which has been re-released with an update. Angela has been on the show before. Welcome back, Angela.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I'm happy to talk to you again. We're recording this a couple of days after the 2022 midterms, and very curious to talk to you about the sort of developments we've seen over the last couple of years and even over the last couple of days. But before we get into that, I'd like to